We've seen how important it is to decide where you're storing your macros and that you give them a name with no spaces and hopefully a sensible name so that you know what each macro does. The last vitally important bit to take on board is whether you're going to record your macros as absolute or relative. Let's show this in a demonstration. So we're starting with the blank book, and what I'd like to do is record a new macro. Now you'll see the option just below here that says use relative references. Without that activated, it's absolute. So I'm going to record the macro. I'm going to call it absolute. Let's store it in this workbook because it's no use to anywhere else. Okay, I'm on A1, and because I'm recording absolute, it remembers A1. I'm going to put Guy Vaccaro, and then let's just auto fit and stop. So that one was recorded absolutely. So regardless of wherever I am on the sheet, I could be over here. If I rerun that macro, it always puts my name in A1 and widens column A. If I then record another macro and ask it to record relatively, then it will record any movements relative to the start of the macro. So I'm actually going to start here. G9. Doesn't really matter where I start, but it's just to show that we're not anywhere near A1. I want to record a new macro. I'm going to call this one relative. Okay. Now before I do anything, I make sure I turn on relative references. And I make sure that it is on, so it's got a green highlight, so I know it's on. And then I can carry on and type my name. Now what you need to be careful of when you're on relative is you're clicking around. If you move from a cell and move down to, then when you run the macro back, it'll move down to. So I'm going to type my name and I'm going to widen the current column, and that will be fine just to demonstrate. Stop. So now if I click over here and run the relative macro, you can see it types my name in the cell that I'm in. If I click over here, macros, relative macro, it types my name in the cell that I'm in. Whereas if I run the absolute one, I'll need to delete that. Even if I'm over here and I run the absolute one, it always goes to A1 to type my name in. So absolute referencing, which is relative referencing not activated, it deals with actual cell references. So if you do something to A1 or you do something to K10, then that's the cell it does it to when it plays it back. Activate relative references, and what it does is it works relative to where your start point is. So when you recorded it, it didn't matter that you were in A1 or F2 or G9. It just mattered that when you played it back, it moved the same relative distance. So if I started here and recorded, but then moved 3 cells to the right and then started doing some actions, when it played back, it would always move 3 cells to the right before it played back. Now being relative can actually be quite useful when you're looking at formatting cells or wanting to type the same thing in, like today's date, for example, because it will do it in the cell that you're in, rather than always going back to the same cell. So a lot of the time, you'll actually use relative referencing rather than absolute. But then some of the time, you'll use absolute rather than relative. It will really depend on what you're trying to achieve. So you need to have that in mind as well as thinking, where am I storing this macro? What is it going to be used for? What are the steps I wish to carry out? You also need to have in your mind, do I want to record this absolutely or relatively? Once you've got those 3 things in your mind, at that stage, you can go ahead and record the macro.